E. On a crisp autumn morning in October 2018, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport buzzed with its usual morning rush. Among the crowd of travelers, a familiar figure moved quietly through the first-class lounge, almost unnoticed despite his status as one of the world's wealthiest individuals. Bill Gates, dressed in his signature style, a simple sweater, khaki pants, and his characteristic glasses, carried only a worn leather briefcase and a laptop. He had just finished a series of meetings with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and was heading to New York for a United Nations conference on global healthcare initiatives. The boarding process for Flight AA-237 proceeded normally. Gates waited in line like any other passenger, checking his phone occasionally and reviewing some documents he pulled from his briefcase. A few people did double takes, not quite believing that someone worth billions would be standing in a regular boarding line. As he made his way down the jet bridge, Gates reflected on the upcoming conference. His mind was occupied with thoughts of vaccine distribution programs and educational technology initiatives, the kinds of problems that have become his life's focus since stepping back from Microsoft's day-to-day operations. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was nearly empty when Gates boarded. He found his seat, 2A, a window position he preferred for its privacy and view. The leather seat was spacious, with plenty of room for him to work during the 5-hour flight to New York. A flight attendant named Sarah Martinez, who had worked this route for 12 years, immediately recognized Gates but maintained professional discretion. She'd served him before and knew he preferred to be treated like any other passenger. "Good morning, sir. Would you like a pre-departure beverage?" she asked with a warm smile. Gates politely accepted a glass of water and began setting up his workstation. He pulled out his laptop, a stack of research papers on global health statistics, and a notebook filled with his characteristic scrawled notes. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, creating perfect reading conditions. The cabin gradually filled with other first-class passengers, a mix of business executives, a famous author, and what appeared to be a retired couple celebrating their anniversary. Gates remained absorbed in his work, occasionally making notes in the margins of his papers. Just as the final boarding call was announced, a commotion could be heard from the front of the cabin. A loud, authoritative voice was arguing with someone about overhead bin space. The voice belonged to James Wheeler, a 52-year-old investment banker from Manhattan, dressed impeccably in a custom-made Italian suit and carrying a designer briefcase. Wheeler was assigned to seat 2B, directly next to Gates. As he approached his seat, his eyes narrowed, scanning Gates' casual attire with obvious disapproval. The contrast between Wheeler's bespoke suit and Gates' modest sweater couldn't have been more striking. The other passengers settled in, the usual sounds of pre-flight activity filling the cabin, the click of seatbelts, the rustle of newspapers, and flight attendants giving final instructions. The atmosphere was routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension building in row 2. Sarah, the flight attendant, noticed Wheeler's expression and body language as he stored his briefcase and sat down. She had seen that look before, a look of someone who thought they were better than others based solely on appearances. She kept a watchful eye on the situation while continuing her pre-flight duties. Gates, still engrossed in his work, barely noticed the subtle drama unfolding beside him. He was reading about a promising new malaria treatment trial in Southeast Asia, making occasional notes on his laptop. His focused demeanor and casual appearance seemed to irritate Wheeler more with each passing minute. As the plane pushed back from the gate and the safety demonstration began, Wheeler shifted uncomfortably in his seat, shooting sideways glances at Gates' well-worn sweater and simple laptop. The morning sun continued to stream through the window, illuminating the first-class cabin as Flight AA-237 prepared for takeoff, unaware that it was about to become the setting for an unforgettable lesson in humility and judgment. Little did anyone know that this routine morning flight was about to become a story that would be shared countless times, teaching a valuable lesson about appearances, assumptions, and the true measure of a person's worth. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when James Wheeler could no longer contain his displeasure. He had spent the first 20 minutes fidgeting in his seat, making subtle sounds of disapproval, and casting judgmental glances at his seatmates' casual attire. As the seatbelt sign clicked off, Wheeler cleared his throat loudly. Gates, still absorbed in his work about global healthcare initiatives, didn't notice. This seemed to irritate Wheeler even more. He pulled out his phone, pretending to take a call, and began speaking just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Yes, Richard, you won't believe the state of first class these days," Wheeler said into his phone, though no one had actually called. "They're letting just anyone in here now. The person next to me looks like he won a ticket in a raffle. Probably his first time in first class." Several passengers within earshot shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in row 3 whispered something to her husband, who shook his head disapprovingly at Wheeler's behavior. Sarah Martinez, the experienced flight attendant, paused while serving drinks, carefully monitoring the situation. Gates continued working, either genuinely unaware of the comments or choosing to ignore them. His fingers moved steadily across his laptop keyboard as he reviewed data about vaccination programs in developing countries. Wheeler, frustrated by the lack of response, became more direct. He turned to Gates and spoke in a condescending tone. "Excuse me, sir, but are you sure you're in the right seat? First class has certain standards." For the first time, Gates looked up from his work. He smiled politely and said, "Yes, I'm quite sure. Thank you for asking." His calm response seemed to frustrate Wheeler even more. "Well," Wheeler continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "I suppose they'll let anyone buy a first-class ticket these days. When I started flying, people dressed appropriately for premium cabins. A proper suit, at minimum. Not." He paused, looking at Gates' sweater with obvious disgust. "Whatever this is." The cabin had grown quiet. Other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. A teenage girl in row 4 had recognized Gates and was urgently whispering to her mother, who gestured for her to stay quiet. Sarah approached with the drink cart, trying to diffuse the tension. "Would either of you gentlemen care for a beverage?" she asked, knowing full well who Gates was but maintaining professional discretion. "I'll have your finest champagne," Wheeler announced loudly. "At least some of us know how to travel properly in first class." He straightened his expensive tie as he spoke. Gates politely requested another water, then returned to his work. This seemingly simple act appeared to infuriate Wheeler even more. He took a long sip of his champagne and continued his tirade. "You know," he announced to no one in particular, "I've been flying first class for 20 years. I've closed deals worth hundreds of millions. I've dined with CEOs and politicians. And now they seat me next to someone who looks like they just walked in from a garage sale." A businessman across the aisle couldn't contain himself any longer. He leaned forward, about to say something, but Gates caught his eye and slightly shook his head, silently requesting that he let it be. Wheeler mistook this interaction as support for his position. "See? Other passengers agree with me. There should be a dress code. This isn't a Greyhound bus." Gates saved his work and slowly closed his laptop. He turned to Wheeler with a gentle smile that had managed multi-billion-dollar negotiations and congressional hearings. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most valuable conversations come from unexpected places." Wheeler scoffed. "What would you know about valuable conversations? Look at you. Those glasses probably cost less than my tie clip." At that moment, a voice from behind them called out, "Mr. Gates, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to thank you. Your foundation's work on malaria prevention saved my sister's life in Uganda last year." The color drained from Wheeler's face as the words "Mr. Gates" echoed in his ears. His champagne glass froze halfway to his mouth as the realization slowly dawned on him. He had just spent the last 30 minutes insulting one of the world's most successful and influential people. The cabin fell into complete silence, all eyes now fixed on row 2, waiting to see what would happen next. The only sound was the steady hum of the aircraft engines as Flight AA-237 continued its journey east, carrying a story that was about to become even more interesting. The silence that followed the revelation of Gates' identity was deafening. James Wheeler sat frozen in his seat, his face cycling through various shades of red. The champagne in his glass trembled slightly as his hand shook with the realization of his massive social blunder. Around them, the first-class cabin had become an impromptu theater. The retired couple in row 1 had turned around in their seats, not even pretending to mind their own business anymore. The teenage girl who had recognized Gates earlier was now recording discreetly on her phone, though her mother quickly made her stop. Sarah Martinez, the flight attendant, moved purposefully through the cabin, trying to maintain some semblance of normal service. She could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. In her 12 years of flying, she had never witnessed such an awkward situation in first class. Wheeler cleared his throat several times, each attempt to speak dying before words could form. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by visible panic. The Italian suit he had been so proud of now seemed to be suffocating him as he loosened his designer tie. I, Mr. Gates, I had no idea. Wheeler finally managed to stammer. His voice, previously so loud and confident, had shrunk to barely a whisper. The contrast was striking to everyone watching. Gates remained perfectly calm, his demeanor unchanged from when he was being insulted. He took a small sip of water and adjusted his glasses, the same glasses Wheeler had just mocked as being cheap. The irony of the situation was lost on no one. A well-dressed woman in row 5, who happened to be a tech journalist, was scribbling notes furiously in her journal. This was the kind of story that could go viral within hours of landing. Wheeler seemed to realize this too, as he noticed more and more passengers watching the scene unfold. "You know," Gates began, speaking in his characteristic thoughtful manner, "I find it interesting that you mentioned valuable conversations earlier." His voice was neither angry nor mocking, but carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. Wheeler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The leather that had seemed so luxurious during boarding now felt like a hot seat under interrogation. He looked around desperately, perhaps hoping for a way to escape, but at 35,000 feet, there was nowhere to go. The businessman across the aisle, who had earlier tried to intervene, was now watching with undisguised satisfaction. He had recognized Gates from the beginning and had witnessed Wheeler's entire performance with growing disgust. Now, he sat back with his own champagne, eager to see how this would play out. "Perhaps," Gates continued, "we could turn this into one of those valuable conversations you mentioned. You seemed quite interested in discussing success and standards earlier." His words carried no hint of revenge or malice, but they caused Wheeler to sink even lower in his seat. Other passengers had begun whispering among themselves. Snippets of conversation floated through the cabin. "Can you believe he didn't recognize Bill Gates? You hear what he said about the glasses? I bet he wishes he could disappear right now." Sarah returned with fresh drinks, placing a new water in front of Gates and deliberately asking Wheeler if he'd like another champagne. Wheeler shook his head, his earlier enthusiasm for fine champagne completely gone. The tension in the cabin continued to build as passengers waited to see how Gates would handle the situation. Would he demand an apology, call for Wheeler to be moved to another seat, request some sort of punishment? A younger passenger, probably in his 20s, had pulled out his laptop and was furiously typing. He worked for a popular tech blog, and this story would be too good to pass up. Wheeler noticed this too, and beads of sweat began forming on his forehead as he imagined the headlines tomorrow. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the fasten seatbelt sign to illuminate with a soft ding. The brief shaking seemed to match the nervous energy coursing through the first-class cabin. Wheeler fumbled with his seatbelt, his usually steady hands betraying his anxiety. Gates simply returned to his laptop, opened it calmly, and began typing again. This somehow made the situation even more intense. The ball was in his court, and everyone knew it. The next few hours of the flight would either become a lesson in humility and forgiveness, or a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging books by their covers. As the plane continued its journey eastward, the tension in first class continued to rise, with all eyes on row 2, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah Martinez found herself in a uniquely challenging situation at 35,000 feet. With 20 years of experience as a flight attendant, she had handled drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and even the occasional celebrity meltdown. But this situation was different. The tension in first class had reached a point where she knew she needed to take action, but how to handle it delicately was the question. Standing in the galley, she consulted quietly with her colleague, Michael Chen. "I've never seen anyone dig themselves into such a deep hole," she whispered, preparing another round of drinks. "Should we offer to reseat one of them?" The problem wasn't just Wheeler's embarrassment or Gates' comfort. It was the growing spectacle the situation had become. Other passengers had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business. The woman from the tech blog was still taking notes, and several others had their phones ready, hoping to capture any dramatic developments. Sarah approached row 2 with fresh drinks, noticing how Wheeler flinched at her approach. His earlier arrogance had transformed into visible distress, His face remained flushed, and his designer suit was now wrinkled from his constant fidgeting. She could see his hands trembling as she set down his requested water. He had switched from champagne after the revelation. "Is everything all right here, gentlemen?" she asked professionally, though she knew very well it wasn't. "We do have a few open seats if either of you would prefer to relocate." She directed this mainly at Wheeler, offering him a graceful exit from his self-created predicament. Gates looked up from his work and smiled warmly. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you, Sarah," he said, reading her name tag. His calm demeanor only seemed to heighten Wheeler's discomfort. Wheeler opened his mouth as if to accept the offer to move, but then closed it again, apparently realizing that fleeing might only make him look worse. The other passengers were watching this interaction with intense interest, making him feel like he was on stage in a particularly embarrassing play. Sarah noticed another problem developing. Passengers from business class had somehow heard about the situation, and people were finding excuses to walk past first class to catch a glimpse of the drama. A line was forming for the forward bathroom, though the rear one was empty. She stationed Michael at the curtain dividing the cabins, trying to maintain some semblance of order. But the story was spreading through the plane like wildfire. Flight tracking websites would soon show this particular flight trending, though no one would know why until they landed. "Perhaps," Sarah suggested diplomatically, "I could arrange for some complimentary noise-canceling headphones for both of you." It was her subtle way of offering them both a chance to isolate themselves from the situation and the mounting attention. Gates declined politely, but Wheeler grabbed at the offer like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. Sarah quickly brought him the headphones, which he fumbled to put on with shaking hands. The situation presented Sarah with another dilemma. Standard procedure was to serve lunch in first class shortly, but she worried that forcing Wheeler to sit through a meal next to Gates might be cruel at this point. She could see him growing more uncomfortable by the minute, especially when Gates calmly pulled out some papers about global vaccination programs that clearly showed the Gates Foundation letterhead. Making an executive decision, Sarah adjusted the meal service schedule, hoping that delaying it might give the situation time to diffuse. She also dimmed the cabin lights slightly, trying to create a more private atmosphere, though it did little to discourage the constant parade of curious passengers from business class. As she worked through these challenges, Sarah couldn't help but admire Gates' composure. Here was one of the world's wealthiest men, who had every right to be offended, continuing his work as if nothing had happened. It was a masterclass in grace under pressure. Wheeler, meanwhile, had closed his eyes and was pretending to sleep, though his rigid posture and occasional nervous swallowing gave him away. The headphones hadn't helped much. He kept adjusting them every few minutes, clearly still acutely aware of his surroundings and his massive faux pas. Sarah moved through the cabin, refilling drinks and trying to maintain normalcy, all while wondering how this situation would eventually resolve itself. With 3 hours still remaining in the flight, she knew this story was far from over. She caught Michael's eye from across the cabin, and they shared a knowing look. This would definitely be a flight they would remember for the rest of their careers. After nearly an hour of uncomfortable silence, Bill Gates did something that surprised everyone in the first-class cabin. He gently removed Wheeler's noise-canceling headphones with a gesture that caused the investment banker to startle like a deer in headlights. "Mr. Wheeler," Gates said softly, adjusting his allegedly cheap glasses, "I believe we got off on the wrong foot. You mentioned earlier that you've closed deals worth hundreds of millions. I'd be interested to hear about your work in the financial sector." Wheeler blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The other passengers leaned in slightly, straining to hear what was unfolding. Even Sarah Martinez slowed her movements in the aisle, pretending to arrange items on her cart while listening intently. Well, Wheeler struggled to find his voice. "I specialize in technology sector mergers and acquisitions." He spoke barely above a whisper, a stark contrast to his earlier booming proclamations about first-class standards. Gates nodded encouragingly. "That's fascinating. The tech sector has certainly seen some interesting movements lately. What's your take on artificial intelligence investments?" This question, focused on Wheeler's professional expertise, seemed to help him find his footing slightly. Color returned to his face as he spoke about something he genuinely understood. "Actually, AI investments have been showing remarkable growth patterns, particularly in healthcare applications." As Wheeler spoke, Gates listened attentively, occasionally asking insightful questions that demonstrated his deep understanding of both technology and finance. The other passengers watched in amazement as Gates skillfully turned what had been an embarrassing confrontation into a meaningful professional discussion. "You know," Gates said during a pause in their conversation, "I once made a terrible mistake in judging someone too. Back in Microsoft's early days, I dismissed an employee's idea because he came to the meeting in casual clothes. Turned out, he had brilliant insights about user interface design that could have saved us months of work." Wheeler's tension began to visibly ease as he realized Gates was offering him a way to save face. The tech journalist in row 5 had stopped writing and was now just listening, captivated by this masterclass in handling difficult situations. "The interesting thing about success," Gates continued, pulling out his well-worn laptop, "is that it rarely looks like what we expect. Did you know that some of the most groundbreaking ideas in technology came from people working in their garages, wearing whatever was comfortable?" A small smile crossed Wheeler's face for the first time since discovering his seatmate's identity. "I suppose I've been guilty of focusing too much on appearances," he admitted quietly. Gates opened a presentation on his laptop, turning the screen so Wheeler could see it. "Here's something I'm working on with the foundation. I'd actually value your financial perspective on this healthcare initiative we're planning in developing countries." The next 30 minutes transformed the first-class cabin's atmosphere. Wheeler, gradually recovering his professional composure, began offering genuine insights about structuring international health programs for maximum impact. Gates took notes, treating Wheeler's input with genuine respect and consideration. Other passengers watched this transformation with fascination. The retired couple in row 1 exchanged knowing looks, while the young tech blogger had completely forgotten about his plans to write an embarrassing exposé, instead furiously noting down points about leadership and grace under pressure. Sarah Martinez, passing by with fresh drinks, noticed how Gates had managed to not only diffuse the tension but turn it into a productive exchange. Wheeler was now sitting up straight again, his earlier shame replaced by engaged professionalism as he explained concepts about international finance to Gates. "The key to sustainable healthcare programs," Wheeler was saying, gesturing with renewed confidence, "might be in creating hybrid funding models that—" Gates listened intently, his expression showing genuine interest. He had taken a moment that could have ended in public humiliation and transformed it into an opportunity for learning and growth. The other passengers were witnessing not just conflict resolution, but a masterclass in emotional intelligence and leadership. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in first class had completely shifted. What had started as a cringe-worthy display of prejudice was evolving into something entirely different. A reminder that sometimes the best responses to judgment and criticism aren't confrontation or revenge, but rather understanding and engagement. Just as the conversation between Gates and Wheeler had found a comfortable rhythm, a new passenger emerged from the business class section, making his way to the first-class restroom. This passenger, Dr. Mark Thompson, was a well-known tech industry veteran who had worked with Gates in Microsoft's early days. "Bill!" Dr. Thompson exclaimed loudly, stopping at their row. "I thought that was you. I was back in business class and heard some interesting rumors about what was happening up here." He grinned broadly, completely unaware of the delicate social balance he was disrupting. Wheeler's face, which had just regained its normal color, suddenly paled again. The casual way Dr. Thompson addressed Gates, and the clear long-term familiarity between them, made Wheeler's earlier behavior seem even more ridiculous. "Mark, good to see you," Gates replied warmly. "We're actually in the middle of an interesting discussion about healthcare funding in developing nations. Mr. Wheeler here has some fascinating insights about hybrid financial models." Dr. Thompson's eyes widened slightly as he looked at Wheeler, clearly having heard about the earlier incident. "Oh, so you're the one who—" he began, but Gates smoothly interrupted. "James has been sharing some valuable perspectives on structuring international aid programs," Gates said firmly, giving Dr. Thompson a subtle but clear signal to drop any reference to the previous drama. The other passengers, who had just begun to lose interest in the row 2 saga, were now fully engaged again. The tech journalist had pulled out her notebook once more, and the teenage girl was unsuccessfully trying to sneak another video. Right. Dr. Thompson nodded, catching on. "Well, Bill, I'm actually heading to that same UN conference in New York. I assume that's where you're going in that signature sweater of yours? He chuckled, making Wheeler visibly wince at the casual reference to Gates' attire. The very same, Gates replied. In fact, Mr. Wheeler's suggestions might be worth bringing up during the funding discussion panel. Some of his ideas about sustainable investment structures could be quite valuable. Wheeler looked up in surprise. After everything that had happened, Gates was not only listening to his ideas but considering presenting them at an international conference. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Dr. Thompson, still standing in the aisle, noticed Sarah approaching with her cart. Well, I should get back to my seat. Good to see you, Bill. And Mr. Wheeler, he added with a knowing smile, it was interesting to meet you too. As Dr. Thompson made his way back to business class, the full weight of the situation seemed to hit Wheeler anew. Here he was, sitting next to Bill Gates, the Bill Gates who was casual friends with industry leaders, who could walk through first class in a sweater because his accomplishments spoke louder than any designer suit, who was headed to influence global health policy at the UN. Mr. Gates? Wheeler said quietly, after Dr. Thompson had left, I feel I should properly address my earlier behavior. Gates held up a hand gently. You know what the best thing about technology is? He asked, changing the subject. It teaches you that appearances can be deceiving. Some of the most powerful programs can run on the simplest interfaces. The metaphor wasn't lost on Wheeler, who managed a small, grateful smile. Around them, the other passengers were watching this exchange with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Even Sarah had slowed her drink service to witness this moment. The teenage girl, who had finally managed to capture a short video, whispered excitedly to her mother, "This is going to go viral." But her mother, understanding the deeper lesson unfolding in front of them, quietly asked her to delete it. As the plane continued its journey eastward, the first-class cabin had become more than just a luxury travel space. It had transformed into a stage where a powerful lesson about judgment, humility, and redemption was playing out at 35,000 feet. Wheeler looked down at his expensive suit, then at Gates' simple sweater, and for the first time that day, he truly understood that success and worth couldn't be measured by what someone was wearing or where they were sitting. The real revelation wasn't just who Bill Gates was, it was what Bill Gates was teaching him about who he, James Wheeler, could become. As the flight entered its final hour, something remarkable began to unfold in the first-class cabin. Bill Gates reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a folder labeled Project Horizon, Global Education Initiative. He turned to Wheeler with a thoughtful expression. You mentioned earlier that you've worked on large-scale financial projects, Gates said. Would you mind taking a look at something? We're developing a new educational technology program for underdeveloped regions. We're struggling with the funding structure. Wheeler, who had spent the last hour gradually recovering his professional composure, straightened in his seat. I'd be honored, Mr. Gates, he replied, his voice carrying a humility that had been entirely absent during boarding. The other passengers watched in amazement as Gates spread several documents across their shared tray tables. Wheeler, now fully in his element as a financial expert, began studying the numbers with genuine interest. See, here's the challenge, Gates explained, pointing to a chart. We want to make this sustainable long-term, not just a one-time investment. But the traditional funding models aren't quite working for this type of initiative. Wheeler nodded, his earlier embarrassment temporarily forgotten as he immersed himself in the familiar world of numbers and projections. Have you considered a hybrid approach? He asked, pulling out his own pen and starting to sketch a diagram on a spare piece of paper. Sarah Martinez, passing by with pre-landing snacks, paused briefly to observe this unexpected collaboration. The same man who had been sneering at Gates' sweater just hours ago was now deeply engaged in helping design a program that could potentially impact thousands of lives. What if we structured it like this? Wheeler suggested, drawing arrows between different funding sources. A combination of private equity, government grants, and a new type of educational bond we've been developing. Gates listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The other passengers could hardly believe the transformation they were witnessing. The tech journalist had stopped taking notes about the scandal and was instead jotting down points about the educational initiative. You know, Gates said thoughtfully, this is exactly why I love these kinds of conversations. Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places. He smiled warmly at Wheeler, who looked both proud and slightly abashed. A young student sitting across the aisle, who had been quietly listening, raised her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Gates? Mr. Wheeler, I'm studying international development at university. Could I ask a question about your funding model?" Without hesitation, both men welcomed her into the discussion. Soon, several other passengers had joined in, turning the first-class cabin into an impromptu think tank. The retired couple from row 1 shared their experiences with educational charities, while the tech blogger offered insights about digital learning platforms. Wheeler, who had started the flight as an antagonist, was now actively facilitating this collaborative discussion. His expertise in finance, combined with his newfound humility, make him an effective bridge between complex financial concepts and practical applications. "This is remarkable," Gates said, reviewing Wheeler's notes. "We've been working on this problem for months, and in one flight, we might have found a viable solution." He turned to Wheeler. "Would you be interested in consulting with our foundation on this project?" Wheeler's expression was a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "I would be honored, Mr. Gates. Though I must admit, I never expected this flight to turn out this way." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had initially judged Gates by his appearance was now being invited to help shape a global education initiative. It was a powerful reminder that opportunity often comes disguised as adversity. As the pilot announced their initial descent into New York, Gates gathered the papers and handed Wheeler his business card. "Have your office contact mine next week," he said. "And James?" he added with a slight smile. "Feel free to wear whatever makes you comfortable to the meetings." The other passengers, who had witnessed this entire transformation, broke into spontaneous applause. Wheeler, for the first time since the flight began, laughed genuinely. His designer suit, which had seemed so important hours ago, now felt far less significant than the ideas and connections he had made. Sarah, preparing the cabin for landing, couldn't help but smile. In her 20 years of flying, she had never seen such a complete transformation of a passenger, nor witnessed such a powerful lesson in judging less and listening more. As Flight AA-237 touched down at JFK International Airport, the story that had unfolded in first class was already spreading throughout the plane. Passengers from business and economy class had heard whispers of the incredible transformation that had taken place up front. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, Wheeler stood up and faced the first-class cabin. His voice, now steady and sincere, carried throughout the quiet space. "I owe everyone here an apology, especially you, Mr. Gates. I started this flight as exactly the kind of person I usually criticize, someone who judges books by their covers." Gates rose as well, straightening his famous sweater with a smile. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments," he responded, extending his hand to Wheeler. As passengers began gathering their belongings, something unexpected happened. The teenage girl who had tried to record the earlier drama approached Wheeler with her phone. "Sir, I deleted all the videos I took earlier," she said. "I realized this story wasn't about embarrassing someone. It was about learning and growing." Wheeler thanked her, visibly moved by this small act of kindness. The tech journalist approached next, having completely rewritten her article. "Instead of covering the scandal," she explained, "I'd like to write about the education initiative you both discussed. With your permission, of course." Sarah Martinez, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, handed Wheeler and Gates their carry-on items. "In all my years of flying," she said quietly, "I've never seen anything quite like this. You've given us all something to think about." As they walked through the terminal together, Gates and Wheeler continued their discussion about the education project. Other passengers from the flight pointed and whispered, but not for the reasons they might have hours earlier. At the baggage claim, Dr. Thompson from business class approached them one final time. "Bill, the UN conference starts tomorrow at 9 a.m. Will we be seeing both of you there?" Gates looked at Wheeler questioningly. Wheeler straightened his tie, the same one he had bragged about earlier, and nodded. "I believe I have some ideas to contribute, if Mr. Gates thinks they would be valuable." "James?" Gates corrected him warmly. "I think we're well past Mr. Gates at this point. And yes, your ideas would be very valuable." As they prepared to go their separate ways, Wheeler turned to Gates one last time. "You know, I have a daughter who's always telling me I'm too focused on appearances. She's going to love this story." "Tell her to keep an eye out for our education initiative," Gates replied. We could always use young people's perspectives. The story of Flight AA 237 did eventually make its way to social media, but not as a scandal. Instead, it became a tale of transformation, shared in business schools and corporate training sessions as an example of true leadership and the power of looking beyond surface appearances. Wheeler's firm went on to become a key partner in the Gates Foundation's education initiative, helping to bring technology and learning opportunities to millions of children worldwide. He kept the sweater he wore to their first official meeting framed in his office, a reminder of the day he learned to see beyond the surface. Sarah Martinez, the flight attendant, would tell this story countless times over her career, always ending with the same message. In first class, we'd often see wealth and status, but that day, we saw something far more valuable. We saw real human growth. As for Bill Gates, he continued wearing his comfortable sweaters to meetings and conferences, but now with an added story to share when anyone asked about his casual style. The incident even made it into his next book, though he kindly changed Wheeler's name to protect his privacy. 1 year later, at the launch of the education initiative they had discussed on the flight, Wheeler stood at the podium in a simple sweater and jeans. Sometimes, he told the audience, the most important investments we can make aren't in stocks or bonds, but in challenging our own prejudices and remaining open to learning from unexpected sources. And somewhere in the crowd, Bill Gates smiled, wearing his signature sweater, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple choice, the choice to respond to judgment with kindness, to transform conflict into opportunity, and to see the potential in every person, regardless of what they wear or how they appear. The legacy of Flight AA 237 lived on, not just in the success of their education initiative, but in the countless lives touched by the reminder that true worth can never be measured by appearances alone.